My name is Jerk. I am not proud of how hard my name sounds, but it fits the man the world thought I was, not the man I truly became. For 27 years I built my life around one idea, that if I stayed strong enough, provided enough, sacrificed enough, my family would never fall apart. I worked through nights that broke my back and mornings that stole my breath. I buried dreams quietly so my children could grow loudly. And when my first son left for China to study, I told myself distance was temporary and love was permanent. I was wrong. He graduated, relocated, changed countries, changed numbers, changed time zones, and slowly erased us. No calls. No texts. No emails. Weeks turned to months. Months turned into silence so loud it echoed through our home. Peggy, my wife, would sit with her phone in her hand long after midnight, refreshing an empty screen as if love itself might suddenly load. Peter, his younger brother, called him every Sunday like clockwork until the ringing became humiliation. I watched my family age 10 years in 1 year because a son decided absence was easier than honesty. We asked nothing except to hear his voice. We begged nothing except acknowledgement that we existed. But silence was his answer, and silence is a form of cruelty few people talk about. People think abandonment requires a goodbye. It doesn't. Sometimes it's just someone choosing not to answer. Peggy cried quietly because she didn't want me to feel like I failed as a father. Peter grew angry because rejection feels like betrayal when it comes from blood. And me, I stayed calm, because when a man breaks too loudly, the world calls him weak. I started documenting everything. Dates. Call logs. Messages unanswered. Letters returned unopened. Not because I wanted revenge at first, but because pain needs proof when the truth is later questioned. Friends told us to let it go. Relatives said boys become men and forget home. But forgetting is not the same as cutting off. One night Peggy collapsed from stress, her body finally saying what her heart had been holding. That was the night something inside me hardened into resolve. I realized silence was not just emotional neglect, it was legal abandonment. I consulted professionals quietly. I learned that family court doesn't just exist for broken marriages, it exists for broken duties. When parents abandon children it is called neglect. When adult children abandon dependent parents emotionally and financially after documented reliance, it has consequences. My son thought distance made him untouchable. He thought new borders erased old responsibilities. He underestimated patience. The court filings were not loud. They were precise. Evidence speaks louder than anger. Peter helped me organize records. Peggy stopped crying and started healing. When the summons finally reached him overseas, he responded for the first time in years. Not with love. Not with apology. With anger. That response alone proved everything. The court didn't punish him with vengeance. It forced accountability. Mandatory communication. Legal acknowledgement. Financial responsibility toward his mother's medical recovery. Public record of neglect. The same son who ignored our voices now begged for privacy. But abandonment does not stay private forever. It resurfaces where reputation matters most. I did not win by destroying him. I won by refusing to disappear. And the greatest revenge was this: the family he thought he escaped became the truth he could never outrun. My son thought responding once would erase years of silence. He was wrong. The moment his message arrived, short, sharp, defensive, accusing us of control and entitlement, I knew the mask had finally slipped. Peggy read it twice, not because she didn't understand it, but because she needed to accept that the child she raised with lullabies and sacrifices now spoke to her like a stranger protecting a secret life. Peter slammed his phone down and walked out of the house that night, not in anger at me or his mother, but in grief. Grief is heavier when it has nowhere to go. I told them both we would not reply emotionally. Emotion is what people use when they have no facts. We had facts. The court process moved slowly, intentionally so. That slowness broke him more than urgency ever could. He sent another message weeks later, then another, each one contradicting the last. First he was busy. Then he was hurt. Then he was too independent to be checked on. Then suddenly we were toxic. That word always appears when accountability is near. Peggy began therapy as part of her recovery, and the therapist documented the psychological impact of prolonged emotional abandonment by an immediate family member. That documentation mattered. Peter wrote a statement not as a bitter brother, but as a witness to years of rejection. And I submitted my records, calm, chronological, undeniable. When the virtual court session was scheduled, he finally called. The first call in years. Peggy froze when she saw his name. Peter couldn't speak. I answered. My voice did not shake. I told him this was not about control or money or pride. This was about consequences. Silence has weight. Distance has limits. Family does not dissolve because one person decides it does. He accused me of ruining his future. I told him futures built on denial always collapse eventually. During the hearing, he appeared confident at first, well-dressed, articulate, rehearsed. But confidence leaks when questioned with timelines. Why no calls during medical emergencies? Why no response to registered letters? Why blocking multiple family numbers? Why refusal of mediation before court involvement? His answers drifted. Excuses don't age well under oath. Peggy spoke last. Not with anger. With quiet truth. She said she didn't want punishment. She wanted recognition that she was still his mother, that her existence deserved acknowledgement. That broke something in him the law never could. The ruling was firm but fair. Mandatory scheduled communication. Financial contribution toward documented family support obligations. Legal record of emotional neglect. No jail. No drama. Just responsibility. The kind he ran from. Afterward, the messages changed. Not loving. Not warm. But present. And presence is where healing begins, even if it's forced at first. Peter stopped chasing him and started living his own life. Peggy smiled again without checking her phone every minute. And me, I learned that revenge isn't about hurting someone back. It's about standing still while the truth catches up to them. The months after the ruling were quieter but heavier. Forced communication is an awkward thing. It arrives on schedule like a bill you didn't plan for and don't want to pay. My son called when required, spoke when prompted, answered when documented. His voice carried obligation, not love. But obligation is still recognition, and recognition is the first crack in denial. Peggy listened more than she spoke. Every call drained her, yet every call also stitched something small back into her sense of worth. Peter refused to be part of the calls. He said he was done offering his heart to someone who treated it like an inconvenience. I didn't push him. Everyone heals differently. What my son didn't realize was that while the court forced him to show up for us, life was preparing to force him to need us. His overseas job began to unravel quietly. The same arrogance that allowed him to erase family also poisoned professional relationships. Employers tolerate talent but never entitlement. When his work visa renewal stalled, panic replaced pride. He called outside the scheduled time for the first time. Not because he missed us, but because he was afraid. Peggy cried after that call, not from joy, but from the painful clarity that her son only remembered home when the world stopped applauding him. I told her the truth gently. This was the reversal. This was the moment every absent child eventually faces. Independence without roots becomes isolation. He asked for advice. For help. For reassurance. I gave him none that night. I told him we would talk during the next scheduled call. Accountability does not bend to desperation. When that call came, his tone was different. Quieter. Slower. Less certain. He asked about his brother. Peter declined to join. He asked about his mother's health. Peggy answered honestly without softening the damage. He apologized then, finally, but apologies without timing are confessions, not healing. I accepted his words without rewarding them. The court had done its job. Now life was doing the rest. His reputation abroad suffered when legal records surfaced during background reviews. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to close doors. He learned what silence costs when it's documented. Over time, he began calling even when not required. Asking instead of demanding. Listening instead of defending. Peter eventually answered one call months later, not to reconnect, but to set boundaries. That conversation was short and real and painful. And necessary. Peggy regained strength, not because her son returned, but because she stopped waiting. And me, I watched it all knowing that revenge was never about courtrooms or records. It was about refusing to let abandonment rewrite reality. He left thinking distance erased responsibility. He learned that truth follows quietly and waits patiently. Time did what force never could. It stripped away his illusions layer by layer. The more his life abroad tightened, the more he reached backward, not with entitlement anymore but with caution, as if afraid one wrong word would sever the thin thread he had finally acknowledged. Peggy noticed it first. She said his voice sounded younger again, not innocent, but unsure. A man unsure of himself either grows or hardens. I watched carefully to see which path he chose. Peter remained distant, building his own future, refusing to orbit a brother who once acted like gravity didn't apply to him. That distance hurt my son more than any court order ever did. One evening he asked me directly why I didn't fight harder to force love back sooner. I told him the truth he had avoided his whole life. Love that is forced rots. Responsibility is what keeps it alive long enough to heal. He went silent on the line, not the old cruel silence, but the kind where someone finally hears something they can't unhear. He admitted then that during his years away he had been ashamed. Ashamed of where he came from. Ashamed of needing family. Ashamed that his success felt smaller when shared. Shame is a powerful motivator for cruelty, especially when aimed at the people who know your beginnings. Peggy forgave him quietly that night, not with words, but with a softness in her tone that told him forgiveness was possible but not guaranteed. Weeks later, his visa situation collapsed completely. He had to return, not as a triumphant son, but as a man confronting the home he tried to erase. The reunion was not dramatic. No hugs. No tears. Just three people standing in the same room measuring how much damage time can do. Peter nodded once and left. Peggy held herself together with dignity. I shook his hand, not as a father welcoming a child, but as a man acknowledging another man's return to accountability. He stayed nearby but not with us. Independence has a cost when bridges are burned. Over months, he showed up consistently. Not grand gestures. Small ones. Appointments attended. Conversations finished. Apologies repeated without demand for acceptance. Slowly, Peggy's laughter returned fully. Peter allowed limited contact. And my son learned the final lesson abandonment teaches too late. You can run from people who love you, but you cannot outrun the record of who you were when they needed you. The family court closed the case eventually. Not because everything was perfect, but because responsibility had been restored. Revenge was never about humiliation. It was about balance. He took our silence for weakness. He learned it was restraint. And restraint, when finally released, changes everything. The real punishment did not arrive with shouting or judgment. It arrived with routine. My son woke each day knowing he had to face the people he once erased. No audience. No drama. Just memory. Peggy treated him kindly but not closely. Kindness without closeness is a mirror that shows you exactly how much trust you destroyed. Peter avoided shared spaces, choosing absence not out of revenge but self-respect. That hurt my son more than rejection ever could because it showed him that love is not owed even by blood. He tried to earn his way back with effort, with money, with favors, but effort without patience always reveals desperation. I told him nothing changes quickly when damage was done slowly. Community whispers reached him next. People asked casual questions. How long are you staying? Are you back for good? Silence followed his answers. Reputation does not shout when it collapses, it steps back quietly. Opportunities hesitated. References were cautious. The same distance he once used as a weapon now surrounded him from all sides. Peggy watched him learn humility the way only a mother can, with pain and hope intertwined. She never defended him to others. She let his actions speak because finally they existed. One night he asked me if I hated him. I told him hatred requires energy I refused to waste. Indifference would have been easier but truth demanded engagement. I told him what he did was abandonment and abandonment leaves scars even when forgiven. He cried then. Not loudly. Not performatively. The way men cry when pride finally loses. That was the moment the story truly turned. Not when courts ruled. Not when records were filed. But when he understood that silence had made him small. Peter eventually agreed to sit in the same room with him. No reconciliation. Just coexistence. That meeting lasted 15 minutes and changed everything. Peter spoke plainly. He said he did not miss his brother during the silence. He mourned him. Because people who disappear are treated as dead by the heart. My son nodded and accepted it. Acceptance is heavier than defense. Peggy held Peter afterward and did not apologize for him. That was her strength returning. Months passed. My son built a quieter life. No running. No hiding. He volunteered. He listened. He waited. Trust returned slowly not because he deserved it but because consistency has gravity. The family court became a closed chapter, but its lesson remained open. Responsibility does not end when the file closes. It begins when no one is watching. I am Jerk. I did not raise a perfect son. I raised a human one who chose absence and learned its cost. Revenge was never cruelty. It was clarity. Silence is a choice. Distance is a statement. And family is not something you can pause and resume at convenience. The court did not give us justice. It gave us structure so truth could surface. Peggy regained her peace. Peter protected his boundaries. And my son learned the hardest lesson of all. You can leave home, but you cannot leave the consequences of how you left. The turning point was not forgiveness but fatigue. My son grew tired of pretending strength while carrying shame. Each day he stayed near but never inside the family circle reminded him that return is not the same as restoration. Peggy stopped asking how he was doing and started asking how she was feeling. That shift unsettled him. For the first time, he was no longer the emotional center of our world. He attempted explanations, long monologues about pressure, culture shock, independence, fear of failure. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said one sentence only. Pain explains behavior, it does not erase damage. That sentence followed him longer than any punishment. Peter's life advanced rapidly once he stopped hoping. New work. New confidence. New distance. My son watched his younger brother become what he thought he was overseas, respected, grounded, unafraid of connection. That comparison cut deep. Not because of jealousy, but because it exposed the lie that success requires disappearance. Peggy faced her son one afternoon and told him something she had rehearsed for years in silence. She said, "I did not stop loving you when you left. I stopped recognizing myself while waiting." That was the moment he understood the real crime was not silence, but theft of time. He tried to compensate with presence. Showing up early. Staying late. Offering help unasked. But effort cannot reverse history. It can only shape what comes next. Slowly, his desperation softened into patience. He learned to wait without demanding outcome. That was growth. The court's shadow lingered longer than expected. Employers asked questions. Officials hesitated. Backgrounds were checked. Nothing dramatic, just enough friction to remind him that records outlive explanations. He learned that reputations are not ruined loudly, they erode quietly. The same way families do. One night he admitted something he had never said aloud. He believed ignoring us made him powerful. That power felt good until it isolated him completely. He said loneliness abroad felt like freedom at first, then like exile. No one to call. No one obligated to care. He built walls and mistook them for independence. Peter finally allowed a longer conversation months later. No reconciliation. No brotherly warmth. Just honesty. He said, "You don't get to disappear and come back expecting the same access. Trust is rebuilt at the pace of the injured, not the apologetic." My son accepted that without argument. That acceptance mattered. Peggy began traveling again. Visiting friends. Laughing openly. Living without checking her phone. That was the true reversal. Her peace no longer depended on her son's behavior. He noticed. And he understood that control had shifted permanently. My son chose to stay close even when nothing was promised. That decision marked the end of entitlement. He no longer asked when things would be normal. He understood normal had changed. Consistency became his currency. Silence no longer his weapon. And I watched all of it knowing revenge was never destruction. It was allowing reality to respond where emotion once begged. He left believing distance erased duty. He returned knowing absence carries weight. The family did not break him. The truth did. The hardest lesson arrived after everything settled. After apologies slowed. After routines formed. After tension softened. My son realized that healing does not feel like victory. It feels ordinary. No applause. No forgiveness ceremony. Just quiet accountability repeated daily. That ordinariness unsettled him more than punishment ever could. He asked once if things would ever go back to how they were before China, before silence, before distance. Peggy answered gently but firmly. She said, "We are not going backward. We are moving forward with memory. Memory is not cruelty. It is protection." He nodded and did not argue. Peter's boundaries became permanent features, not temporary defenses. Limited calls. Neutral tone. Clear limits. My son respected them because he finally understood that boundaries are the price of survival, not rejection. Respecting them became his proof of change. The community adjusted to the new reality. Whispers faded. Questions stopped. People accepted what consistency demonstrated. My son learned that trust is rebuilt silently, one uneventful day at a time. Drama destroys progress. Stability restores it. Peggy's health improved steadily. Not because her son returned, but because she stopped tying her worth to his attention. That independence was the final shift. She loved him without chasing. That balance frightened him at first. Then it taught him respect. One evening he admitted he feared becoming irrelevant to us. I told him relevance is earned through presence, not demanded through blood. Blood opens the door. Behavior decides how long you're allowed to stay inside. He began mentoring others quietly, warning younger people about cutting off family without closure. Not preaching. Just sharing experience. Pain becomes useful when it prevents repetition. That was growth we could not force. Peter acknowledged that growth one day without praise. He simply said, I see the effort. That sentence carried more weight than forgiveness ever could. My son carried it like a medal he did not rush to display. Time passed without incident. No crises. No court dates. No ultimatums. That peace was the reward. Revenge stories often end with collapse. This one ended with restraint. Restraint is harder. And I understood finally that the strongest response to abandonment is not rage. It is documentation, patience, boundaries, and letting reality speak where emotion once screamed. My son learned absence is never neutral. It always leaves a record. As the years edged forward, the silence that once destroyed us transformed into something else entirely. It became space. Space for Peggy to rediscover who she was beyond motherhood defined by waiting. Space for Peter to build a life unshadowed by comparison. Space for my son to sit with the consequences of his choices without resistance. Silence no longer belonged to him alone. He stopped explaining himself. That was another change. People who are still hiding explain too much. People who accept responsibility let action stand without narration. He showed up consistently to family events without expectation of warmth. Presence without demand is humility in motion. Peggy noticed that when she spoke now, he listened without interrupting. Not to reply. To understand. That difference mattered. Listening is the opposite of abandonment. It says I see you even when I cannot fix what I broke. Peter eventually invited him to a public event. Neutral ground. Short duration. No emotional risk. That invitation was not forgiveness. It was acknowledgement that effort had crossed a threshold. My son did not overstep. He left early. Restraint preserved progress. I watched him confront another quiet truth. Redemption does not erase history. It lives beside it. People remember who you were even while accepting who you are becoming. Carrying that duality without bitterness is maturity. One afternoon he said something unexpected. He said the court saved him from becoming someone worse. Not because of punishment, but because it forced him to look at himself without excuses. Accountability arrived before permanent damage did. That awareness changed how he spoke about responsibility forever. Peggy stopped calling him my son in moments of pain and started calling him by his name. That subtle shift reflected restored agency. She no longer defined him by the wound. She defined him by present behavior. That was healing. Peter admitted privately that the anger had faded. Not because it was resolved, but because it no longer controlled him. Letting go of rage did not mean letting go of memory. It meant choosing peace over punishment. My son faced the hardest truth late one night. He said if the court had not intervened, he might never have returned. Silence would have hardened into permanent absence. Structure interrupted that trajectory. Sometimes love needs scaffolding when it collapses. I realized then that revenge had never been the goal. Restoration through consequence was. Not everyone returns better. Some only return quieter. But quiet accountability is still change. And change, when sustained, rewrites endings without erasing beginnings. With time, even the weight of consequence became familiar. My son no longer flinched when the past was mentioned. He learned to sit with it instead of running. That stillness was new. Before, he chased distance to feel powerful. Now he accepted proximity to remain grounded. Peggy began telling stories again, old ones from when the boys were young. She did not censor joy or pain. My son listened as if hearing his own childhood from the outside. That perspective reshaped him. Memory became education rather than accusation. Peter's success continued quietly. He never used it to compete or prove anything. That dignity humbled my son more than confrontation ever could. Watching his younger brother thrive without abandonment dismantled the myth he once believed. There were setbacks. Moments when frustration surfaced. Times when my son expected progress faster than it came. Each time, restraint corrected him. Healing does not reward impatience. It punishes it by slowing further. He learned to wait without resentment. One evening, he admitted that leaving had felt like erasing a version of himself he hated. He thought distance would rewrite identity. Instead, it froze it. Growth only resumed when he returned to face what he avoided. Escape delayed development. It never completed it. Peggy forgave herself fully during this period. Not for his choices, but for blaming herself for them. That release restored her strength completely. A mother's guilt dissolves only when she sees evidence that love was not the problem. Peter allowed occasional laughter. Brief, cautious, but real. Laughter is the last thing to return after betrayal. When it does, it signals safety more than joy. My son noticed and protected those moments carefully. I stopped monitoring outcomes. That was my final release. I no longer measured progress or anticipated collapse. Control gave way to trust in process. The same patience that documented abandonment now allowed recovery to unfold naturally. My son began speaking openly about accountability to others. Not as a warning. As a confession. Confession changes the speaker more than the listener. Owning the truth publicly prevented relapse into denial. The story no longer needed an ending shaped by revenge. It carried its own weight forward. Consequence had done its work. Silence had lost its power. And family, though altered forever, stood on honesty instead of illusion. The deeper truth surfaced when comfort arrived. My son confessed that rebuilding was harder than leaving. Leaving required one decision. Staying required thousands. Every day he had to choose humility over defense, patience over entitlement, presence over escape. That daily choice exhausted him in a way success never had. Peggy told him something that finally reframed his struggle. She said love does not feel heavy when it is honest. What exhausts you is carrying who you pretended to be. That sentence settled into him slowly, changing how he carried himself everywhere. Peter revealed later that during the years of silence, he prepared himself to never see his brother again. He mourned early so he could survive. Hearing that broke my son in a way anger never could. He realized his absence had forced premature grief. That damage could not be undone, only acknowledged. My son stopped asking for reassurance. That was another milestone. People who still doubt their place seek confirmation. People who accept consequence focus on contribution. He began contributing without asking where he stood. There were nights he sat alone remembering birthdays missed, illnesses ignored, moments where a single call would have changed everything. Regret arrived without drama. Quiet. Persistent. Regret that teaches is different from regret that destroys. He allowed it to teach. Peggy's forgiveness deepened not into closeness but into freedom. She no longer felt responsible for his emotional state. She loved him without obligation to fix him. That separation of love and responsibility restored her completely. Peter finally said something that closed a long open wound. He said, "I don't hate you anymore." That was not reconciliation. That was release. My son understood the difference and respected it. Release is not return. The family court documents were archived, but their imprint remained. Structure had interrupted abandonment before it became permanent. Accountability arrived before character calcified. Timing mattered. Consequence saved what emotion could not. My son accepted that some losses were final. Certain moments would never be relived. Certain versions of relationships would never return. Acceptance replaced bargaining. That acceptance made him steadier than hope ever had. I reflected on my own role finally without self-blame or defense. I had loved, provided, documented, waited, and acted when silence became harm. That balance was not vengeance. It was protection. Protection of dignity is never cruelty. The deepest change appeared when my son began correcting others who joked about cutting off family. Not harshly. Calmly. He spoke of silence as damage, not independence. His words carried authority because they were lived, not learned. Peggy watched him with clarity instead of longing. She saw growth without needing it to validate her motherhood. That independence was the final gift she gave herself. Peter and my son reached a functional peace. Not closeness. Stability. They could exist without tension. That alone was a victory earned slowly and honestly. And I understood the true end of revenge is irrelevance. Not because pain disappears, but because it no longer drives decisions. Consequence did its work and stepped aside. Life resumed without spectacle. This story was never about destroying my son. It was about refusing to disappear when silence tried to erase us. Absence has weight. Distance leaves records. And accountability, when faced fully, does not end families. It strips them down to truth and rebuilds them on something real. Thank you for staying with us through this intense journey. Remember, every choice has a consequence, and every silence tells a story. If this story touched you, inspired you, or made your heart race, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because the next unforgettable tale is just around the corner. Stay tuned, and never underestimate the power of truth.